Malefics are an archetype of monsters mostly based on the game's most iconic boss monsters from the first 3 eras of Yu-Gi-Oh! And were played by Paradox in the Bonds Beyond Time movie where they were called the strongest monsters in history. Unfortunately, in the OCG, TCG, and Master Duel, Malefics haven't really lived up to the legendary status the anime gave them, which is why they're the topic of today's video, delving into why they never saw too much competitive success, as well as where they actually saw use. Now, what is a Malefic monster? The Malefic monsters can be divided into 2 categories. There's the Malefic Dragons and the Malefic Gears. The Malefic Dragons, other than Truth, Paragym, and Paradox, are all based on iconic Yu-Gi-Oh! Boss monsters and features the likes of Malefic Blue Eyes White Dragon, Malefic Cyber End Dragon, and Malefic Stardust Dragon. These monsters can't be normal summon or set, and, other than Truth Dragon, are instead brought out by banishing a respective monster from your hand deck or extra deck. So in order to bring up Malefic Red Eyes, you have to banish a Red Eyes Black Dragon from your hand or deck, and to bring up Malefic Cyber End Dragon, you needed to banish the original Cyber End Dragon from your extra deck, and so on and so on. This mechanic was actually why Malefics were so strong in the anime, as they bypassed the restrictions of the regular summoning mechanics, until Paradox was able to spam the field with multiple Malefic monsters. But in the TCG, OCG, and Master Duel, most of the Malefic monsters have an effect that stipulates that you can only ever control one Malefic monster at a time. And that's not the only restriction that comes with these dragons, as they also prevent your other monsters from declaring attacks while you control them, meaning that you can only ever attack with one monster at a time. And on top of that, if you don't control a face-up field spell, the Malefics will destroy themselves. And some of them even require Malefic World specifically to be on the field so they don't blow up. There are some variations between the effects of Malefic monsters, and some even have their own unique effects, like how Malefic Truth Dragon can only be summoned when a Malefic monster destroyed by battle or card effect, or how Malefic Stardust Dragon protects the field spells from being destroyed by card effects. But for the most part, they're pretty synonymous boss monsters that only vary by stats and the monster they banish to summon themselves out. The Malefic Gears, on the other hand, are a series of monsters designed to allow the deck to synchro summon and access Malefic Paradox Dragon, their synchro boss monster. Malefic Parallel Gear is the only tune in the archetype and allows you to synchro summon despite most of the Malefic dragons only allowing one Malefic monster on the field, and does this by letting you use Malefic monsters in your hand as synchro material. Malefic Paradox Gear isn't a tuner, but special summons Malefic Parallel Gear from your deck and allows you to add a Malefic monster to your hand, effectively making it a 1-card synchro summon, and you can even banish it from your graveyard to summon out a Malefic monster from your hand instead of banishing their respective monster. So, why are Malefics failed cards? In theory, the Malefics lend themselves to 2 different styles of play depending on the deck they're in. In a pure strategy, you would rely on their easy summoning conditions as well as the consistency the Malefic world provides to ensure that you always have a huge beat stick on field. And in combination with Malefic Gears, you can use the varying levels of the Malefic monsters in your hand to access level 9, 10, and 12 synchro boss monsters. Or instead of playing a pure Malefic strategy, you could splash the Malefic monsters into a deck that's already playing their associated brick, allowing you to splash Malefic Blue Eyes into your Blue Eyes list with ease, since the deck is already playing multiple copies of Blue Eyes White Dragon. This gives these iconic strategies access to a free beat stick they can also use as an extender for extra deck plays, provided they have a field spell on field. In practice, however, Malefics have a lot holding them back, both as a pure strategy and as a splashable option in other decks. The first big issue is that most of Malefics need to play a ton of bricks in the main deck that do not synergize that well with the rest of the deck in order to bring out their boss monster. Red Eyes, Blue Eyes, and Rainbow Dragon are all necessary to play to bring out their Malefic forms, but are useless for the rest of the Malefic strategy and make the deck quite bricky. The common restrictions of the Malefic Dragons have also virtually ruined any chance that they might be viable as a pure strategy, especially because most of the Malefic Dragons are basically just vanilla beat sticks that don't have a positive effect that make their harsh restrictions worthwhile. Not being able to attack with any other monster while you control a Malefic Dragon makes them pretty ineffective as beat sticks and OTK tools, as you're only ever going to be able to beat over one of your opponent's boss monsters. Even the strongest Malefic monster, Truth Dragon, can't OTK your opponent on an open board. The first restriction is even worse, as it makes it so the archetype is incapable of comboing with itself, since it only allows you to ever control one Malefic monster at a time. This makes it so you can't swarm the field with your Malefic monsters as Paradox did in the anime, severely limiting your board presence and your range of extra deck plays, making it really hard for Malefics to access more modern tools like Lynx or XC summoning. Synchro summoning is also difficult for the deck, as it's entirely reliant on you drawing Malefic Gears. But by far, the worst restriction of the Malefics is that you have to control a face-up field spell. Otherwise, they just destroy themselves before you can use them, and this directly counters their main upside of being easy to summon, since by requiring a field spell to not blow themselves up, it makes every Malefic monster a 2-card combo to bring out rather than just a free special summon. This is part of why Malefic counterparts aren't often splashed into other strategies. Blue Eyes, for example, definitely appreciates having a free level 8 extender that they can use to go into their extra deck, and even has multiple field spells that they can benefit from. But they're not always going to have access to those field spells, and even if they did, the deck has a whole range of better options for free level 8 extenders that actually have beneficial effects and don't blow themselves up. However, despite how unappealing the Malefics are for most strategies, A couple of the Malefic monsters have actually seen a decent amount of competitive success. The decks that have been able to use the Malefic monsters the best either negate their on-field effects so their restrictions don't apply, or center around a strong field spell that they have easy access to. Both instances, however, heavily rely on the use of floodgates. The most interesting Malefic card by far is Malefic Stardust Dragon. This card comes with all the same restrictions you'd expect from Malefic dragons, and is even the second weakest Malefic dragon based on stats alone, having a measly 2500 attack and 2000 defense, just like the original Stardust Dragon. This makes Malefic Stardust Dragon a decent beatstick, but a lot weaker when compared to something like Malefic Cyber Dragon, or even Malefic Blue Eyes White Dragon. But even despite its weak stats, Malefic Stardust Dragon is the Malefic monster that's seen the most amount of competitive play. Unlike most of the other Malefic monsters, Malefic Stardust Dragon actually has an effect that's designed to mirror its uncorrupted counterpart, as it protects all face-up field spells from being destroyed by card effects. This has allowed for Stardust Dragon to be an absolute boon for decks that revolve around using their field spell, and nowhere is that more apparent than in Gravekeepers. Gravekeepers are a strategy that occasionally appears in the metagame whenever there's a graveyard-reliant strategy at top tables, specifically because of how easily the deck can find and utilize their field spell, Necro Valley. Necro Valley has had a number of changes in how its effects works throughout the years, but basically it shuts down graveyard interaction by preventing cards from being banished from the graveyard or moved from the graveyard to a different place. This has made Necro Valley an integral piece of the history of Yu-Gi-Oh's meta, as its floodgate effect is so strong that it's capable of shutting down strategies that rely on the graveyard almost entirely. Even in the modern format, Necro Valley has seen a ton of competitive play since it's one of the strongest counters to tier limits. But Gravekeepers specifically have a ton of synergy with Necro Valley. Commandant allows for the deck to consistently find Necro Valley, and while it's on the field, all Gravekeepers gain a huge 500 attack boost. But that's not all. Because Necro Valley also allows for Gravekeepers to use some incredibly overpowered effects like Royal Tribute, which can hand rip every monster from your opponent's hand, or Hidden Temples, which can lock your opponent out of special summoning entirely. When you have a strong floodgate on field that benefits you immensely, your opponent is going to want to out it immediately. And for a while, Gravekeepers really struggled to protect their Necro Valley from targeted destruction, which is why Gravekeepers began to incorporate Malefic Stardust Dragon, especially in older formats. You see, Gravekeepers could easily play Malefic Stardust Dragon without any kind of brick in their main deck, because Malefic Stardust Dragon could summon itself by banishing a Stardust Dragon from the extra deck, so you weren't forced to play an unsearchable brick, unlike most of the other Malefic dragons. So it was astonishingly easy to bring Malefic Stardust Dragon to the field. And because the entire Gravekeeper strategy was centered around finding Necro Valley, you were always going to have access to it so Malefic Stardust didn't blow itself up. As soon as Malefic Stardust hits the field, you are safe in knowledge that your opponent can't destroy your Necro Valley with Mystical Space Typhoon or Heavy Storm, protecting your floodgate and stopping your opponent from playing while also being a decently strong body on field, which you can use to gradually close out the game. Essentially, Malefic Stardust Dragon makes Necro Valley difficult to out, and Necro Valley makes Malefic Stardust Dragon difficult to out by floodgating your opponent, making them complement each other perfectly. This strategy survived for a decently long time, but eventually most of the Gravekeepers found their way out of Malefic decks as they began to focus less on how the Gravekeepers complement Necro Valley and more on how floodgates complemented the Malefics, with Commandant being the only Gravekeepers monster left still seen play in these deck lists because Commandant could search for Necro Valley. In general, the Malefic cards have a lot of synergy with some of the game's strongest floodgates. A card like Rivalry, There Can Be Only One, and Gozen Match can lock your opponent into only controlling one monster. And a card like Dimensional Fissure doesn't affect the summoning conditions of the Malefic monsters, as they banish to summon themselves out anyways, making Dimensional Fissure a really solid tool in slowing your opponent down. But there is one specific floodgate which pairs extremely well with the Malefic monsters by getting rid of one of their downsides. With Skill Drain face up on the field, 2 of the 3 main restrictions of the Malefic monsters don't apply since their continuous effects are being negated. So while you still can only control one Malefic monster, your other monsters can now attack, and you also don't need to control a field spell to prevent your Malefic monsters from being blown up. All the while, Skill Drain is also negating the on-field effects of every monster your opponent controls, preventing them from playing and making it harder to access their high attack boss monsters. This was particularly advantageous for Malefic monsters, as most of them have pretty high attack and are difficult to out without monster effects, which is why Malefic Cyber and Dragon saw a decent amount of competitive play in decks that actually use and centered around Malefics. Malefic Cyber and Dragon doesn't have any unique effects that make it better to run over the other Malefic monsters, but what it does have is 4,000 attack. This makes it tied with Malefic Rainbow Dragon as the second strongest Malefic monster in the game, as it's only being out by Malefic Truth Dragon, which comparatively has a much harder summoning condition. But the reason why Malefic Cyber and Dragon saw competitive play Malefic decks and Malefic Rainbow Dragon didn't was because of the slight difference in their summoning conditions. Malefic Rainbow Dragon demanded you run the original Rainbow Dragon in your main deck, a bricky card that you wouldn't even be able to summon if you drew it. Malefic Cyber and Dragon, on the other hand, like Malefic Stardust Dragon, has its associated monster located in the extra deck. This made Malefic Cyber and Dragon 10 times better than Malefic Rainbow Dragon, as you could just run 3 copies of Malefic Cyber and Dragon alongside 3 copies of the original Cyber and Dragon in your extra deck, rather than being forced to run any copies of Rainbow Dragon and make your deck more bricky for no reason. This made Malefic Cyber and Dragon the perfect choice of Malefic monster to pair with Skill Drain. It was incredibly easy to summon and came with an insane attack stat to boot. This is why Malefic Cyber and Dragon is the only Malefic monster other than Malefic Stardust Dragon that has seen any competitive success. No other Malefic monster has seen the same heights of success as either card, and they were eventually ran side by side with the same strategy by virtue of being the strongest Malefic cards that didn't also require main deck brick. Necro Valley was also played with these Malefic decks, but rather than being the main focus of the deck as it was in the Gravekeepers, Necro Valley was instead run alongside other generically good field spells, such as Gear Town. Now, Gear Town doesn't appear to do anything for Malefics or offer any kind of floodgate that you could use to slow your opponent down, which makes it appear to be a strange choice since you're unlikely to ever use this effect to perform a tribute summon. But the way the old field spells rules worked allowed for Gear Town to bring some insanely strong beaters to the field and apply a ton of pressure to your opponent. You see, when Gear Town is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon any Ancient Gear monster from your hand deck or graveyard. And the way you would trigger this effect of Gear Town is by activating a new field spell over your Gear Town. In the modern era, this doesn't do anything, as your Gear Town would just be sent to the graveyard. But older field spell rules meant that activating a new field spell would destroy the old one, and thus allow for Gear Town to trigger, as long as you set the other field spell on top of Gear Town face down, otherwise it would miss timing. This gave Malefic decks access to another powerful beater by just activating their Necro Valley over their Gear Town, and allowing them to summon Ancient Gear Gadgetron Dragon for free, a card with an impressive 3000 attack stat that helped making OTKing way easier, especially under Skill Drain. This style Malefic deck did eventually fade out. The floodgates were still strong, and so were the beaters, but they just couldn't keep up with the ever-evolving meta with their style of caveman Yu-Gi-Oh! Despite the interesting use of Malefic Cyber and Dragon and Malefic Stardust Dragon, most of the other Malefic monsters have only ever seen Fringe experimentation at best. Malefic Red Eyes is a good example. It's by far the weakest of all the Malefic dragons, but it benefits a lot from being a Red Eyes card. This has allowed it to see a decent amount of experimentation in Dragon Link, a deck which already plays cards like Black Metal Dragon, which could search out Malefic Red Eyes Dragon by linking it off into Striker Dragon, a card which searched for a strong field spell. But because of the requirement of having to play the original Red Eyes Black Dragon, Dragon Link players found that it was far more optimal to just play Red Eyes Darkness Metal Dragon, rather than playing a bricky card that was hard to use if you drew it. Malefic Blue Eyes also saw experimentation as an extender in Blue Eyes, as a target for Melody of Awakened Dragon. But with the release of Blue Eyes Alternative White Dragon, Malefic Blue Eyes became obsolete, as Blue Eyes lists would rather just search Alternative Dragon alongside the original Blue Eyes to summon it. The Malefics in general became really clunky and awkward to use in the modern era due to the restrictions and negative effects. And as a result, in order to make Malefics a playable strategy, they printed a card which actively negates the main downsides of Malefics, Malefic Territory. With Territory, you get a free copy of Malefic World from your deck and put it into your field zone, fulfilling the field spell requirement even though Malefic World doesn't have an amazing effect like Necro Valley. Territory's first continuous effect allows you to actually swarm the field with Malefic monsters by literally changing the effects of all Malefic monsters. Now, while you control Territory, instead of only being able to control one Malefic monster at a time, you can control multiple Malefic monsters, providing they each had different names. And its second continuous effect acts as a one-sided skill drain. It doesn't come with the same benefits as skill drain since it doesn't floodgate your opponent in any way, but it does allow you to attack with multiple monsters by negating the effects of your Malefic monsters during the battle phase. Territory is an excellent card that seeks to fix all of the issues of Malefics and does a pretty decent job of making the strategy actually functional. But even despite Territory's absurd design, it's not enough to allow for Malefics to see play in the modern era. A monster having high attack or being an okay special summon isn't reasoned enough for Malefics to see competitive play, especially not as a splash in other decks which would rather just play stronger special summon. All in all, despite the role and history of Yu-Gi-Oh's meta, the Malefics were just a flash in the pan and didn't have a huge impact on the way the game was played as a whole. Their use did showcase, however, the power of floodgates when combined with high attack and hard to out monsters, and the DNA Malefic decks can even be found in modern strategies like Guru, which uses a combination of floodgates alongside the high attack Red Eyes Dark Dragoon to lock your opponent out of play in the game. Gren Maju also carries the spirit of Malefics by emphasizing floodgates that banish while using Gren Maju as a big beat stick to steal games from your opponent. But in terms of Malefics themselves, it's really unlikely they'll ever see competitive play again. Other decks do what they aim to do, but way better, and even as an extender in decks that could use them, there are just better options available. The deck would need a lot to see play again in the modern format, including ways to easily find floodgates, or at the very least, a better field spell than Malefic World. As an anti-meta strategy, it could definitely score some wins against unsuspected opponents, especially since the floodgates Malefics use are insanely strong. But as it stands right now, it's going to take a whole lot more for them to even enter Rogue tier right now, let alone the metagame. Alright, and that's the video. If you can think of any other ways to fix the mechanic, or know of any other cards or mechanics that failed, please let us know down in the comments below.